The meeting began at 2:30 a.m. Marco Rubio sat across from Ibrahim Traoré, the documents on the table containing proposals that would overturn America's 70-year foreign policy. Traoré's proposed agreement was so radical that accepting it would end Rubio's career, while rejecting it would put millions of lives in Africa at risk. But the real shock was that the file in Traoré's hands contained America's darkest secrets. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou had never hosted such a clandestine meeting. Deep within its fortified walls, in a conference room that had been swept for listening devices 3 times in the past hour, the most dangerous diplomatic negotiation of the 21st century was about to unfold. Marco Rubio, the United States Secretary of State, had arrived in Burkina Faso under cover of darkness, his presence known only to a handful of the most trusted advisors in the American intelligence community. The official record would show him attending a routine diplomatic conference in Morocco, but the reality was far more complex and perilous than anything in his 30-year political career. As Rubio's unmarked aircraft had touched down at the military airfield outside the capital, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, he had received an encrypted message through channels so secure that only 7 people in the entire American government had access to them. The message was brief, but electrifying. The young lion of Africa wishes to speak with the eagle of America. What we discuss will change the world. Time is running short. The sender was Ibrahim Traoré, the 34-year-old captain who had seized power in Burkina Faso and was rapidly becoming the most influential and dangerous voice in West Africa. Western intelligence agencies had been tracking his movements with growing alarm as he systematically dismantled the post-colonial power structures that had kept Africa dependent on European and American interests for decades. But what had compelled Rubio to risk everything for this secret meeting was the second part of the message: "I have something that belongs to you. Something that your enemies would pay dearly to possess. Something that could destroy you or save you. The choice will be yours." Now, as Rubio sat in the dimly lit conference room, looking across the polished mahogany table at the young African leader who had become the symbol of a continental awakening, he was about to discover what Traoré meant. "Secretary Rubio," Traoré began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a legend across Africa, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I know the enormous risks you've taken to be here tonight." Rubio studied the man across from him with the practiced eye of a veteran diplomat. Traoré wore a simple military uniform without elaborate decorations, but his presence filled the room with an almost electric intensity. His eyes held an intelligence that reminded Rubio uncomfortably of himself at that age. Ambitious, idealistic, and absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. "Captain Traoré," Rubio replied carefully, his diplomatic training keeping his voice neutral despite the circumstances. "Your message suggested this meeting was of critical importance to both our nations. I'm here to listen." Traoré smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Good. Because what I'm about to show you will test everything you believe about your country's role in the world, about the nature of power, and about the price of maintaining an empire built on lies." He reached into a leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder marked with classifications that made Rubio's blood run cold. The stamps were authentic. He recognized the format, the specific typography, even the slight color variations that made American classified documents nearly impossible to forge. "How did you obtain classified American intelligence?" Rubio asked, his diplomatic composure masking the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "The same way America has been obtaining classified African intelligence for the past 70 years, Traoré replied. "Through sources within your own government who believe that truth matters more than politics, that justice matters more than power." Traoré opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Rubio found himself looking at documents he recognized. operation reports, budget allocations, and strategic assessments that should have been locked in the most secure vaults in Washington. Operation Desert Falcon, Traore said, pointing to the first set of documents. Your CIA's program to destabilize governments across the Sahel region from 2018 to 2023. Total budget $2.4 billion. 17 governments targeted. 8 successful regime changes. An estimated 340,000 civilian casualties. Rubio's poker face didn't waver, but internally he was reeling. Operation Desert Falcon was so classified that fewer than a dozen people knew of its existence, and the casualty figures Traore cited were ones that had never been officially acknowledged. Operation Golden Harvest, Traore continued, indicating another stack of papers. Your systematic extraction of rare earth minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo through shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Estimated value of extracted resources $8 to $47 billion over 15 years. Amount paid to local communities $2.3 million. The room seemed to grow colder as Traore methodically revealed document after document, each more damaging than the last. Operation Invisible Hand. Your manipulation of currency markets across West Africa, creating artificial inflation to force dependency on American aid programs. Operation Silent Partner. Your funding of warlords and militias to maintain regional instability that justifies continued military presence. Operation Eternal Debt. Your coordinated effort with the IMF and World Bank to ensure African nations remain in perpetual financial bondage through structural adjustment programs designed to fail. Rubio felt as though he were watching his entire worldview crumble in real time. These weren't just intelligence failures or bureaucratic oversights, they were systematic programs of exploitation that violated every principle America claimed to represent. "Where did you get these?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "From patriots within your own government who could no longer stomach what they were being asked to do," Traore replied. "Did you know that your State Department has a specific budget line for democracy promotion that actually funds the overthrow of democratically elected governments? Or that your foreign aid programs are designed with built-in mechanisms to create dependency rather than development?" Traore pulled out a series of photographs and placed them in front of Rubio. They showed meetings in what appeared to be luxury hotel suites, with several men in expensive suits, shaking hands around tables covered with documents and briefcases filled with cash. These were taken over the past 8 months in Geneva, London, and Dubai, Traore explained. The men in these photographs are executives from 5 major American mining corporations, 3 weapons manufacturers, 2 private military contractors, and 1 pharmaceutical giant. They're meeting with representatives from the French government, the World Bank, and certain African officials to discuss what they call the Africa problem, specifically how to maintain Western control over African resources while managing the growing threat of Pan-African unity. Rubio studied the photographs with growing horror. He recognized several of the faces, men he had personally met with in his capacity as Secretary of State, men whose companies had received government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Traore continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Create humanitarian crises through coordinated economic pressure and strategic conflict, then offer international peacekeeping forces and development aid as the solution. The peacekeepers would naturally require logistical support from American companies, mining concessions to fund their operations, and long-term security arrangements to prevent future instability. "Captain Traore," Rubio said carefully, struggling to maintain his composure, "even if these documents are authentic, even if these meetings took place as you describe, I'm not sure what you expect me to do with this information." Traore leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. I expect you to help me save Africa, Secretary Rubio, and in the process, perhaps save America's soul from the corruption that has consumed it. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a different folder, this one unmarked but somehow more ominous than the classified documents that had preceded it. This contains the details of my counter-proposal, Traore said. A new framework for African-American relations based on equality, mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than exploitation and dependency. Rubio opened the folder and began reading. What he saw made his previous shock seem trivial by comparison. The African Renaissance Accord, Traore explained as Rubio scanned the documents. A comprehensive agreement that would fundamentally restructure the relationship between America and Africa and serve as a model for a new approach to international relations based on justice rather than power. The proposal was staggering in its scope and audacity. It called for the complete cancellation of African debt to American institutions, the return of cultural artifacts looted during the colonial period, and the establishment of a $500 billion development fund financed by a tax on American corporations that had profited from African resources over the past century. But that was just the beginning. Joint military bases, Traore continued, but with African and American forces serving as equals, not with Americans as commanders and Africans as auxiliaries. Technology transfer programs that actually transfer technology instead of creating permanent dependency. Trade agreements that benefit both parties instead of just enriching American corporations at the expense of African development. Rubio looked up from the documents, his mind racing. Captain, what you're proposing would require congressional approval, treaty ratification, and fundamental changes to American foreign policy doctrine that have been in place for 7 decades. Even if I wanted to support this, I don't have the authority to make these commitments unilaterally. I know, Traore said simply. That's why this isn't a negotiation, Secretary Rubio. It's an ultimatum. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Rubio felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I'm sorry, Rubio said, his diplomatic training finally beginning to crack under the pressure. Traore opened a third folder, and this time Rubio could see that his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from suppressed rage. Operation Crimson Harvest, Traore said, his voice now carrying an edge of steel. Your government's plan to assassinate me and 17 other African leaders over the next 18 months, to be followed by the installation of more compliant governments across the continent. The document Traore showed him was a detailed operational plan bearing the seal of the Central Intelligence Agency and the authorization signatures of officials Rubio recognized. It outlined a sophisticated program of targeted killings designed to eliminate what it termed disruptive elements in African leadership. My name is third on the list, Traore said with chilling calm. The plan calls for my assassination to be carried out during a public appearance next month, with the killing blamed on Islamic extremists affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. This would justify increased American military intervention in the region and the installation of a more compliant government that would reverse my economic reforms and restore Western access to our mineral wealth. Rubio stared at the document, his mind reeling. He had seen operational plans before, but never one so coldly calculating in its disregard for human life and international law. The plan included detailed psychological profiles of each target, analysis of their security arrangements, and contingency plans for dealing with potential popular uprisings following the assassinations. The timeline shows my assassination scheduled for February 15th. Traore continued, his voice never wavering. President Kony of Ivory Coast on March 3rd. Prime Minister Diomande of Mali on March. The entire operation is designed to appear as a wave of Islamic terrorism that will justify a massive increase in American military presence across West Africa. Captain Traore said, his voice barely above a whisper, This is monstrous. Even if such a plan exists, there are people in my government who would never allow—" "Your government has already allowed it," Traore interrupted, pulling out another document. "This is the authorization memo, signed by your National Security Advisor and approved by a classified presidential finding. The operation has been active for 6 months. 3 of the leaders on the list have already died in what appeared to be accidents or natural causes." Rubio felt as though the floor was falling away beneath him. The implications were staggering, not just the moral horror of government-sanctioned murder, but the potential consequences if such operations were ever exposed. How many people have to die for America to maintain its position in the world? Traore asked quietly. How many democratically elected leaders have to be overthrown? How many resources have to be stolen? How many children have to die in mines and factories to keep American corporations profitable? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Rubio had spent his entire career justifying American foreign policy as necessary for global stability and democratic values, but confronted with the brutal reality of that policy's implementation, he found his rationalizations crumbling. "Captain Traore," Rubio said slowly, his voice hoarse with emotion, "what you're asking for isn't just a policy change, it's a complete reimagining of America's role in the world, a fundamental shift in how we understand power and responsibility." "Yes," Traore agreed, "it is. It would end my career, probably end the careers of everyone who supports it. The political backlash would be enormous. Congress would never approve it. The American people would never accept it." "Yes," Traore said again. "All of that is true, and you're willing to risk war, economic chaos, and international instability to achieve this transformation." Traore was quiet for a long moment, staring at the document spread across the table. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Rubio understand why this young man had become a symbol of hope across an entire continent. "Mr. Rubio, my country has been at war for 70 years. Not a war with guns and bombs, though we've had plenty of those, but a war against poverty, disease, and exploitation. My people have been dying, not in dramatic battles that make headlines, but in quiet desperation that the world chooses to ignore." He picked up one of the photographs from the classified documents, an image of children working in a cobalt mine, their faces covered in dust, their eyes empty of hope. These children die so that Americans can have smartphones and electric cars. Their parents work for pennies so that American corporations can report record profits. Their governments are kept weak and corrupt so that American interests can be protected. Tell me, Secretary Rubio, how many of these children's lives is American prosperity worth? The question hit Rubio like a physical blow. He thought of his own children, safe in their private schools, worried about homework and soccer practice instead of survival and starvation. "You ask if I'm willing to risk instability to change this system," Traore continued, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I ask you, how can any system built on such suffering be considered stable? How can any peace built on such injustice be considered real?" Rubio found himself thinking about Maya, the homeless child who had saved his life and taught him about moral consistency. Her question echoed in his mind. Why do foreign children matter more than American children? Now he was confronting the inverse of that question. Why should American interests matter more than African lives? What guarantees do I have that you'll honor this agreement if I accept it? Rubio asked, his resistance beginning to crumble. The same guarantee you've given to every African leader for the past 70 years, Traore replied with a bitter smile. None. You'll have to trust me just as we've been forced to trust you despite decades of betrayal and broken promises. The irony wasn't lost on Rubio. For decades, American foreign policy had been built on the assumption that American promises were valuable, while foreign promises were worthless. Now he was being asked to operate under the reverse assumption. "I need time to consider this," Rubio said, though he could feel his resolve weakening with every passing moment. "Time is something we don't have," Traore replied, checking his watch. "In 4 hours, the sun will rise over Ouagadougou. In 8 hours, my security forces will intercept the assassination team that's currently moving into position around the presidential palace. In 12 hours, if I don't have your answer, those documents will be in the hands of journalists around the world." Rubio closed his eyes and tried to think clearly, but every option seemed to lead to disaster. Accept the agreement and face political suicide, congressional investigations, and the possible collapse of American influence globally. Refuse and watch as America's credibility evaporated overnight, potentially triggering international conflicts that could last for decades. But as he sat in that dimly lit room, looking at the evidence of his country's systematic exploitation of an entire continent, Rubio realized that the real disaster had been happening all along. The only question was whether to continue perpetuating it or to finally take responsibility for ending it. "Captain Traoré," he said finally, opening his eyes and looking directly at the young African leader, "I have a counter-proposal." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. Give me 6 months instead of immediately implementing this. The political process in Washington is incredibly complex, and rushing will only ensure failure. In exchange, I'll personally guarantee your safety during that period and begin implementing preliminary measures immediately." "What kind of preliminary measures?" Rubio pulled out his own tablet and began typing rapidly. "I can redirect $100 million in military aid to humanitarian programs within the week. I can order the immediate suspension of Operation Crimson Harvest. I can begin informal discussions with key congressional leaders about debt relief programs, and I can start a comprehensive review of all American aid programs to ensure they're actually serving their stated purposes." Traoré considered this carefully, and in 6 months, I'll either deliver a signed agreement that implements at least 75% of your proposals, or I'll resign from office and publicly explain why, including the release of selected documents that expose the worst abuses of American policy in Africa. You would end your own career rather than continue the current system. Rubio thought about Maya's question, about the children in the cobalt mines, about the assassination plans bearing his government's seal. "Captain, a career built on lies and violence isn't worth preserving. If I can't serve my country with honor, then I'd rather not serve at all." For the first time since the meeting began, Traore smiled genuinely. "Secretary Rubio, I believe we have the foundation for an agreement." The two men spent the next 6 hours working through the details of what would become known as the Ouagadougou Accords, a comprehensive framework for restructuring African-American relations that would serve as a model for a new approach to international cooperation based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. As dawn broke over Burkina Faso, Rubio and Traoré signed a memorandum of understanding that would, within months, fundamentally alter the global balance of power. The document established timelines for debt forgiveness, technology transfer, and resource sharing that went far beyond anything previously attempted in international relations. But more importantly, it established a principle that would reshape American foreign policy for generations to come, that genuine security could only be achieved through genuine justice, and that America's strength would ultimately depend on its willingness to be a partner, rather than a hegemon. "Secretary Rubio," Traoré said as they shook hands in the early morning light, "you've just made a decision that will define not only your legacy, but the legacy of your entire nation." Captain Traoré, Rubio replied, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. "I hope it's a legacy that future generations of both our peoples can be proud of." As Rubio's aircraft lifted off from the military airfield, he looked down at the African landscape below and realized that he was returning to Washington as a fundamentally different person than the one who had left. The documents in his briefcase would trigger the most significant foreign policy shift in American history. But more importantly, they represented a commitment to the kind of moral leadership that America had always claimed to represent, but rarely practiced. The implementation of the Ouagadougou Accords would not be easy. Over the following months, Rubio faced fierce opposition from corporate interests, congressional hawks, and foreign policy establishments who viewed any reduction in American dominance as a threat to national security. The pharmaceutical and mining lobbies spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to block the agreement. 3 congressional investigations were launched into Rubio's unauthorized negotiations. The media portrayed him as everything from a naive idealist to a dangerous radical who was undermining American interests. But Rubio also found unexpected allies. The revelation of Operation Crimson Harvest, carefully leaked to select journalists, created such a public outcry that Congress was forced to investigate the entire assassination program. Young African-American lawmakers like Congresswoman Alexandria Williams and Senator Marcus Johnson became passionate advocates for the accords. International allies, initially skeptical, began to see the agreement as a model for more equitable relationships with developing nations. Most importantly, the American people, when presented with the full truth about their government's actions in Africa, reacted with a mixture of horror and determination to do better. Public opinion polls showed that 68% of Americans supported the accords once they understood what American policy had actually been accomplishing in Africa. The signing ceremony at the United Nations 6 months later was attended by heads of state from around the world. President Chen of China called it a new model for great power relations. Prime Minister Singh of India described it as proof that even the most powerful nations can choose justice over domination. Most remarkably, President Macron of France announced that the European Union would be developing its own version of the accords for its relationships with former colonies. But the most moving moment came when Traore addressed the General Assembly after the signing. Today marks not the end of American power, but its transformation, he said. For 70 years, America has been the world's hegemon, ruling through a combination of economic incentives and military threats. Today, America chooses to become something more difficult but more sustainable, the world's partner. He paused, looking directly at Rubio in the audience. Secretary Rubio and I did not start as friends. We met as adversaries, each representing systems that had been in conflict for generations. But we discovered something that gives me hope for the future of international relations, that even the deepest conflicts can be resolved when powerful people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over dominance. The applause that followed lasted for nearly 10 minutes, but Rubio barely heard it. He was thinking about that night in Ouagadougou, about the moment when he had been forced to choose between preserving his career and preserving his conscience. The choice had seemed impossible at the time, but sitting in the UN General Assembly, watching African and American flags side by side, he knew he had made the right decision. 3 years later, the effects of the Ouagadougou Accords were visible across 2 continents. American corporations, initially resistant to the new ethical standards, discovered that fair trade practices actually increased their long-term profitability by creating more stable markets and better relationships with local partners. African economies, freed from the burden of impossible debt payments, began experiencing unprecedented growth. Most remarkably, the threat of terrorism in West Africa had virtually disappeared as young people found economic opportunities that had never existed before. But perhaps the most significant change was in how America saw itself. The country that had once justified any action in the name of national security now prided itself on setting global standards for ethical international relations. American diplomacy, once based on threats and bribes, became based on genuine partnership and mutual respect. Critics argued that America had become weaker, that the Accords had reduced American influence and prestige, but supporters pointed to the unprecedented levels of international cooperation on issues like climate change, pandemic response, and global poverty. When disasters struck anywhere in the world, the international response was swift and coordinated in ways that had never been possible under the old system of competitive nationalism. Marco Rubio served out his term as Secretary of State and then retired from politics, establishing the Maya Foundation, named after the homeless child who had first taught him about moral consistency to promote ethical international relations. He spent his remaining years teaching at universities and writing about the importance of aligning foreign policy with moral principles. Ibrahim Traoré was re-elected twice in democratic elections and became known as the father of African Renaissance. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso became one of the most prosperous nations in Africa, serving as a model for sustainable development and democratic governance. The secret meeting that had begun at 2:30 a.m. in a conference room in Ouagadougou became the subject of countless books, documentaries, and academic studies. Historians would debate whether the transformation could have been achieved through less dramatic means, whether the risks taken were justified, and whether the long-term benefits outweighed the short-term costs. But for the children working in mines who could now attend school instead, for the families who were no longer trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, for the communities that could finally control their own resources and destiny, the debates were academic. The Ouagadougou Accords had given them something that had been denied for generations: hope. In the end, the lesson of that extraordinary night was simple but profound, that the most radical act in international relations is not conquest or domination, but the recognition that all human beings deserve dignity, justice, and the opportunity to control their own future. The secret deal between Rubio and Traore hadn't just shaken the world, it had shown the world what was possible when power chose to serve justice rather than itself.